You need to take this seriously. Europe and North America are making a series of fatal mistakes at the altar of environmentalism that threaten to disrupt the world's food supplies and agriculture. But that's only the beginning, because this conversation between Jordan Peterson and writer Michael Yon reveals how what is happening to the Dutch farmers right now is about to create waves of civil unrest in the future. And there's also some finer details of that entire saga that I want to explore after you watch this next clip.
Germany's in trouble, and a huge part of this, as far as I'm concerned, is because of these unbelievably ill-advised energy policies that were hypothetically put in place to aid the planet's movement towards lower climate transformation. And fair enough, maybe we have some concern on that front, but this absurd panicking combined with post hoc central planning and this insane notion that we can somehow make energy more expensive without producing cascading sequences of catastrophes is naive beyond belief and malevolent, at least in part. So now Germany's in trouble because they're hyper-reliant on the Russians. And so now back to the Dutch farmers. Now, the Dutch government put pressure on the farmers recently because a legislative body that was EU controlled, that's my understanding, decided in favor of an idiot environmental group and the court compelled the government, so that's a non-legislative body, by the way, the court compelled the government to act in relation to the farmers. And apparently the farmers have had enough of this.
This is a big topic. As you know, the Dutch farmers are probably the finest and most efficient in the world, right? And practically no Dutch people seem to know that, which is extraordinary, right? And they don't realize how important their farmers are to the world, as the second largest food exporter in the world.
Yeah, it's a miracle, right? Because how big is Holland? It's a tiny country. You can drive across it in like 3 hours.
Here in Netherlands, there's an information campaign to make the farmers look like bad guys here as well. I mean, these are the new kulaks, right?
In Canada, it was the farmers and the truckers who rose up, the misogynists and the bigots and the racists in our prime minister's terms. And then that's triggered these co-occurring protests in the US and in Holland. And now it isn't easy to get farmers upset either, because those tractors that they bring to the protests, those things are bloody expensive, and most of the farmers don't own them. They have to finance them. And so they're running on very thin margins, 3 to 5% a year generally. And you have to be one canny person to run a big farm in a modern economy. You have to be paying attention to all sorts of unbelievably complicated and sophisticated things. And so when the farmers have been pushed to the point where they're willing to take time away from their farms to spray manure on the government steps, it's probably time to listen. So I agree with you on that front 100%.
If there's one emotion that has permeated every action and policy decision on behalf of the Dutch authorities, it has to be arrogance. That's what was behind the practically forced downsizing of Dutch farms to appease EU directives, the crackdown and arrests we saw against the over 40,000 farmers and 2,000 truckers by not heeding their call, and then the courts overstepping the line into legislation by mangling and bending Dutch laws. And arguably that last part is what started it all in the first place. The Dutch NGO Urgenda Foundation, which claims to make sure the country upholds EU climate change directives, has become a thaw between the government and the Dutch farmers. And how? Well, after nearly a decade of suing the government and pushing the courts to act on climate change, they were finally able to get a landmark precedent back in 2019 to legally bind the Dutch government into massively slashing carbon emissions to 25% below 1990 levels by the year 2020. And guess what? Despite the many questions raised over whether the courts could even force the government like this, the Netherlands eventually did reduce their carbon emissions by the target, all while the other side of the equation with the farmers was quietly slipped under the rug. Watch that massive slump after 2019 after the verdict was announced, and you realize how good a chart like this looks on the resume of the Dutch government and leaders. But on the other side of the balance sheet, the Dutch farmers find their profit margins shrinking with higher production costs, taxes of emissions, as well as the expensive credit they get from banks after becoming a relatively riskier credit investment for lenders. All of this can disturb the critical balance of the world's most efficient agricultural sector.
Clearly, the WEF, the WEF, they call it WEF here in the Netherlands, the World Economic Forum, is trying to control food supply, right? That is production and distribution, right? And so, and one of the ways to do this is, as Stalin did and Mao did in China, and Stalin did in Ukraine and Russia, is to take the farms away from the traditional farmers and then put your farmers on that land. And let's talk about this. If the Dutch farmers, let's take this as a premise, are the most efficient in the world, well, let's just say they're the second most efficient. Why would you knock them out of the saddle to get somebody else to produce the food? Where? Indian farmers? I mean, who's going to produce this food in a much less efficient way that would create even more pollution? This is clearly about control. Also, there's something that you never hear in any press that I've heard in the United States is the tri-state city. Tri-state city is this smart city that they're proposing to build between the tri-states are Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany. So this mega city, basically, that would take up all this farmland in that area and which would bring huge amounts of more people into this area, right? So the tri-state city is something you don't hear much about, but that's another part of this plan. There was a fire about maybe 10 days ago. I went to it right after the next morning, and it's at a picnic distribution center, which is there was an investment, $600 million into this picnic food distribution center from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, coincidentally, and it burned down, right? And so that brought a little raised some eyebrows. Why did that thing just burn down? There's many of them. There's others in Netherlands that are growing. But the bottom line is the Bill and Melinda, or Bill Gates, is buying up farmland, as you know, all over the place.
I know. He is the biggest private landowner in the United States right now, and the land that he's buying up, he's taking out of food production. And it seems to be because he's obsessed about meat production, at least in part, doesn't believe that that's part of a sustainable future. It's the same thing happens on the bloody energy front. It's like, well, Australia won't build coal-generating electrical plants, but they'll ship their bloody coal to China, where they're going to build much dirtier plants. And the same thing applies to Canada. If we shut down our energy industry, which our bloody, insane, narcissistic, delusional, traitorous prime minister happens to think is a good idea and seems to be working as hard as he can to manage, all that's going to happen is that we're going to cede the ground to people like Putin, who we also turned into a radical enemy with his hands on the control pump for Europe. I mean, I don't see how we could be stupider here in the West if we actually took courses in stupidity and tried as hard as we could.
That's actually one of the most curious pieces of the entire puzzle. People in the United States are well aware of Bill Gates' massive farmland acquisitions in the last few years, which stand at over 270,000 acres right now. But the fact that his drive for greater control of the agriculture and food supply would stretch as far as the Netherlands is understandably unsettling for the Dutch farmers. So here's the gist of what happened. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation became a majority investor in the raising of over $600 million for a vegan and environmentally friendly grocery delivery service in Europe called Picnic. It was seen as a potential competitor to the meat industry, as many people believed it was going to be the center for making and distributing plant-based meat alternatives. But the warehouse for the Picnic store eventually burned down in a fire that still hasn't been explained, giving rise to a flurry of controversies around what really happened. Some people even believe it was an act of arson by the angry Dutch farmers to protest against Bill Gates, making inroads into their sector. All in all, it's clear that the Dutch farmers are screaming to get attention for their demands and needs to be met, while the Dutch government continues to make the fatal mistake of ignoring the most productive, efficient, and critical sector of their economy.
We seem to be doing everything we can to break everything as rapidly as possible. And then I wonder too, has it got to the point where the people who think, that you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, and there's too many people on the planet, think that this is some sort of like needle's eye that we have to go through, all this mass starvation and death so that we end up with a sustainable population. I mean, Jesus Christ, that's a dim and grim scenario. But as you said, why would you take the Dutch farmers out of business when they're so unbelievably hyper-productive and efficient? It's not like there's too much food, especially not if we don't have farmers.
if anything, I would be trying to get a large agricultural institute here in Netherlands to teach other farmers how to be as efficient as Dutch farmers are, replicate these farmers. In Afghanistan, actually, many of the farmers coming over, I was out in the farms quite a lot, were actually Dutch farmers to teach Afghans how to do things better. But the bottom line is, as you can see, there is a huge, I watch you all the time, you know what's happening. There's a huge authoritarian the desire to have a one world order is clearly strong. And this isn't the first time it's happened. As you know, it's a constant in human behavior. And also as somebody who studies the human psyche a lot, as you do, you realize pulling these farmers off of their traditional farms unroots them. It cuts their anchor, their boat anchor. They're going to be drifting, culturally. So that makes them much easier to, you can't control farmers well. That's why Stalin wanted to get rid of the farmers. Stalin had to get rid of those farmers because farmers have a mind of their own. Same with Mao. You got to get rid of those farmers because they think for themselves. And likewise here, these Dutch farmers think for themselves. And so they're the bad guys. To me, they're the great guys. These are the people
me too, man.
Defend. That's our backbone. They are our backbone. That's why I flew to Netherlands from Mexico. I mean, that's how important this is.
What's insane is that it sounds scarily similar to what we've seen, not just in 1930s Ukraine, but also in communist China during the so-called Great Leap Forward in the 50s and 60s. Though, of course, not to the same extent. We're seeing private farms in the Netherlands tilled and managed by extremely expert farmers be bought out or merged with other farms in a move that is almost reminiscent of collectivization, and it's all driven by a utopian vision that the Dutch government or the EU can take the world's most efficient agricultural sector and tweak it to slash emissions and make it align with their environmentalist dreams. For an agriculture sector with one of the world's highest crop yields at nearly 9.4 tons per hectare, tipping this vital structure over means both the Netherlands and the countries that import its agricultural products will be met with massive food shortages and inflation if that sector falls. When you look at why someone would be willing to risk that, there's no other reason that comes to mind than having greater control. That's the eerie workings of an invisible power you see behind a lot of these large-scale moves that don't seem to be justified by any facts on the ground. And for someone like Jordan Peterson, who understands exactly where similar utopian visions have led us in the past, it's worth it putting himself in line to shout this warning to people in power before it's too late.